You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined now by today's panel, Nabila Ramdani and Simon Brooke. Hello to you both. Welcome back.
Hello.
Nabila, you have a book coming out. This is a thing we like to do at the top of our show, is allow our guests to flog whatever it is they have to flog. So, have at it. Tell us what it is called and what it's about.
Well, it's called Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. It might sound, a heavy task, but it's actually a labour of love about a country I was born and raised in, and it's a reflection about the position it finds itself today. As we know, France is a country that lends itself to cliches. That is, people have a romanticised view of the country most of the time, without really understanding what makes it tick and what its major problems actually are.
I mean, just without giving away the ending, and I suspect there isn't a short answer to the question of how do you think France should be fixed, but where would you start? If by some chance or other you ended up succeeding Emmanuel Macron, and if the book is a success, so who knows, what would you start with?
Well, I've tried to look at all this in a very clear narrative that covers every aspect of modern French life. But I would say the starting point would be the political foundations of the country. They are deeply flawed, and France is still currently ruled by an elected monarch, I would contend. And that has been the position ever since the foundation of the Fifth Republic, which was born out of the cataclysmic war with Algeria. Charles de Gaulle was brought in as a strong man, came out of the wilderness to keep the Algerians nationalists in check, and a branch of his own army. And he has been given extraordinary powers. That was meant to be an emergency situation, but ever since, anybody who's elected to that position retains those powers. And that's why we see Macron, for example, bypassing parliament. He can rule by decree without a parliament vote, for example. He's head of the military. And to a certain extent, arguably, he's the most powerful elected leader on earth because he has his button on the nuclear power in a way that the American president doesn't, because he has to go through Congress, for example. So he's a massively powerful leader, and yet, there are many aspects of French life that remain unresolved and remain unfair and unjust in so many ways.
And Simon, as we were just discussing before we came on air, you may be in a position to help with a few early sales for Nabila. Yeah, no pressure or anything.
Yeah, I'm not quite as powerful as Emmanuel Macron, but one bit of power I have at the moment is that it's my turn to choose the book for my local book group. And my dilemma, I think, to be honest, I might have to wait till the next time comes around for me, Nabila, because I've got to choose like the next couple of days. In fact, I think the book we might go for this time is The Escape Artist by Jonathan Friedland, that amazing story of the two inmates who escaped from Auschwitz. But I think what I find fascinating is the fact that when it comes to choosing the book for our book group, I tend to go for non-fiction, and the rest of the people in the book group are all women, so it's me and 5 women, so they tend to choose fiction. And
Did you start this book group in order to meet women, Simon? It's been an outstanding success, if so.
What's slightly embarrassing is that when we started it was like 50-50 gender split, but since then the remaining men have left, so I don't know if it's something I said or
you've driven them out, you've crushed them.
Presumably there's something. Does that make me a silverback or something?
Something
gorilla,
of that
I'm not
ilk.
sure what it is.
Something of that ilk. You couldn't interest them in a very good book I can recommend about Australian rules football.
I'm sure it's just their kind of thing, but
it needs all the help. It needs all the help it can get, is what I'm saying.
Next time, Andrew, I promise.
Well, we will start properly with the alliance known as BRICS, which is to say Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. The leaders of those 5 countries have recently been meeting in Johannesburg, with the exception of the leader of Russia, who stayed home in order to spare his hosts the awkwardness of fulfilling their obligations under the Rome Statute to arrest him, and also possibly to not oversee a sabotage operation he had absolutely nothing to do with. The headline upshot of the BRICS summit is a planned expansion of the grouping to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Argentina and the United Arab Emirates, which at first glance looks way too heavy on the vowels to facilitate a plausible acronym. Something else they're short of, Nabila, and it's not just consonants. There are not a lot of functional democracies among these new members. Where does this end up steering the bloc?
Well, dare I say, we live in an age when India has put a spacecraft on the dark side of the moon, so there's
Indeed.
nothing surprising about attempted changes in the world order. And BRICS currently comprises a number of countries, including India. So again, that's no surprise. But rather ominously, we also find Russia on the list as well. But other BRIC nations such as Brazil, South Africa are certainly burgeoning economic powers. I think that there is no doubt that countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE are probably the most desirable countries that BRICS want to take on board because they're billions in petrodollars. And I think this sums up the lack of morality in the world economics. I was going to say right now, but I think there's never been much morality in world economics anyway. But I think the West can be as worried as it wants about the expansion of BRICS, but capitalism is all about dynamic change, and Western nations are always extremely competitive and indeed cynical themselves in their own actions. But I'm convinced that the expansion will certainly pave the way for dozens more countries to seek admission to the grouping, because it has pledged to address their grievances over a world order many feel is rigged against them. And I think that the deepening of the geopolitical polarization in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and indeed China's declining relations with the United States are certainly spurring efforts by both Beijing and Moscow to forge BRICS into a viable counterweight to the West, if you like. So they will see all this as a new chapter in its efforts to build a world that is, well, fair and just according to their own view of the world, rather than simply being centred in the traditional economic powerhouses.
Now, is there a danger, though, Simon, that if they continue with this philosophy of expansion, and there were reports out of the summit that apparently up to 40 countries were quite interested in joining, that it just ends up becoming a sort of G7 for whinging dictatorships?
Well, I think I mean, as you say, Nabila, there is that the democratic deficit we might see here. So I suppose it depends what this kind of emerging caucus turns into. I mean, is it politically? Is it political or economic? So economically, as has been pointed out, 40%, it comprises 40% of the world's population and about a third of global GDP. That's rising rapidly and will overtake the proportion of GDP represented by the G7. So that might be a good thing if it represents developing nations, the global south. I think it's probably competition is a good thing in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's good to have one central organisation for coordination, but then you get groupthink. If you get different conflicting ideas, perhaps you also get people trying harder. So competition, a lot of people would say, would be a good thing. If it's political, well, I as you say, I do have a problem, especially if you look at the three new members who've just been signed up today: Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt. And then, or even President Xi has made it clear, that he is keen to create this alternative to the democratic West, to what we would say is the rules-based system. And then, of course, if you put this in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when we saw at the UN, by population, only a third of the world's leadership voted to condemn this. So I think it's quite worrying, really, that these non-democratic nations which don't agree with civil rights, with the rule of law, that they are being sort of boosted by this growing organisation.
I mean, it's at least arguable, Nabila, that you won't get too much groupthink if you have a situation where you have Saudi Arabia and Iran who can't stand each other, and Ethiopia and Egypt who can't stand each other, all sitting around the same table. Is it at all encouraging? Are there grounds for optimism that these putative rivals are all at least getting together in one grouping, or does this just end up like the UN or the AU as just another shop full of people bickering with each other?
I frankly think it's rather frightening, because it reinforces the clout of countries who have constantly shown disregard, dare I say, contempt for basic, human rights. They think that the amount of money they have, and they have plenty of that, including natural resources, can whitewash the position in the world, and to a certain extent it is happening, and that's the worrying aspect. But I think that all the democrats in this world should always attach conditions to dealing with them. The West, the democratic West, should not give in, as it were, and constantly exercise pressure and demands on those countries to follow, the decent path of respecting, basic human rights.
Well, on that subject, just finally on this, Simon, is there room here for the G7 to display a bit of a sense of humour and try to poach India and Brazil? Because BRICS is founded by these 5 countries in the first instance because they feel that they are deserving of more respect, attention, power and a greater say than they were getting. And they all have a case. These are obviously 5 important countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, for all the reasons that you were just laying out. But if the G7, apprehended that for Brazil and India in particular, their self-image as a great and large democracy is important to both countries. If the G7 said, sure, come and sit at the cool kids table.
A very nice idea. I mean, again, it's that, as I say, competition. If you did have competition between this organisation, the BRICS, and G7, come and join us, then they would have to try a bit harder, as I was saying. I think what's interesting is just listening to Jim O'Neill, the former Goldman Sachs economist and UK government minister, talking, and he's the guy, of course, who coined the phrase BRICS, even though he didn't want to include the S for South Africa, it's worth noting. But he was saying that actually perhaps one way to do this is not necessarily to look at the G7, but to focus on the G20. And of course, that larger grouping already includes India, China and Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, I suppose expanding the G8, the G9, G10 or whatever is one thing. But on the other hand, we also have an organisation that could encompass these groups. And the other point he makes, which I think is quite important, is that you've got to ask, as we were saying, the BRICS nations are very diverse, very disparate. So what do they have in common? What are they actually looking for together? Or are they just the kind of not G7 group, really? And I think that's probably a weakness that they're going to have to face.
Well, let's scale down from the macro to the micro. And in any democratic system, the mechanism for the removal of an unsatisfactory politician seems self-evident: elections. However, there are occasional circumstances in which this doesn't seem quite enough, e.g. when the representative in question is obviously too bent, drunk and or mad to be taken seriously, or, to bring us to the case in hand, simply cannot be bothered to turn up for the job the taxpayers are paying them to do. Here in the UK, some of the constituents of Mid-Bedfordshire are grumbling about having an absentee MP, specifically Nadine Dorries, who actually was Culture Secretary for some reason, but has not meaningfully graced either Mid-Bedfordshire or Parliament with her presence for some while. Simon, first of all, it is important to note she is still alive. She has not been kidnapped. She appears regularly on her Talk TV show and is said to be writing what will doubtless be a completely ridiculous book exculpating Boris Johnson. But before we get on to the wider ethics of this, I think it falls to you as the British person at this table to try and explain to our international listeners who Nadine Dorries actually is.
Yes, Nadine Dorries, a former nurse and former businesswoman, was Culture Secretary until quite recently. So she dealt with the media, amongst other organisations, famous for trying to privatise the Channel 4 channel in the UK, even though she didn't even know how it was funded. And also, I'm told she asked some senior executives at Microsoft, what are you going to do about your algorithm? And it was pointed out that's probably a question you should be asking Facebook and Google and things. Yes, she's a novelist. She's written I'm not sure if it's romance, chick lit or whatever, novel. So,
according to the reviews, at least typed might be a better word than written.
Well, somebody wrote it and somebody typed it. I don't know, sort of thing. But yeah, she is a controversial controversial character. And as you say, she has not been seen, actually. The last time she made a contribution in the House of Commons was just over a year ago. And the last time she gave a written question in the House of Commons to a government minister was actually 5 years, nearly 6 years ago in 2017. So, she's been surprisingly low profile on the political front, but very much prominent on the niche broadcasting front, shall we say.
So, Nabila, is there an argument, though, that in the specific instance of Nadine Dorries and in similar instances in parliaments around the world, this is surely preferable to them attempting to actually engage in politics?
I actually think it's outrageous that a serving member of parliament can play around like this. Being an MP is literally, it should be considered a sacred role in any democracy. You are literally representing a sizable chunk of the population, and you should respect these people and their interest at all times. And I think over everything else, this is the whole point of representative democracy, isn't it?
Well, there is a rich tradition, Simon, and again, as the British person at the table, do back me up. There is a rich tradition in this country of the MP who simply cannot be bothered. One thinks possibly most famously of Alan Clark, whose diaries did reveal, even while he was still serving, that he was aggressively uninterested in the concerns of his constituency, which he never visited if he could possibly avoid doing so.
And a lot of MPs will tell you they would like to do that as well. So, I have to say, I've worked a lot with politicians. And to some extent, Nabila, as you say, it's an incredible responsibility. And we should put this into context. Most politicians, I would say, really care about what they do. And if you can imagine getting a tidal wave of phone calls and emails from people who really need your help for the most basic things in life, then it's a huge responsibility. But then perhaps that makes it all the more outrageous that a politician is not there doing their thing for the people who rely on them. On the other hand, you could also argue that do politicians work too hard these days? Apparently, Andrew, in the Australian House in Parliament, respondents, according to a recent survey, work 12 to 15 hours a day, both sitting and non-sitting weeks. That's quite a lot.
Speaking to friends of mine who work in politics in Australia, I would say that is perfectly believable.
Yeah,
and I'm sure the same is true for conscientious MPs in any democracy. And Simon is quite right in pointing out that is most of them. The occasions on which I have, mostly for union-related reasons, gone to an MP surgery, it's sort of to act as someone's representative, etc. I have left thinking, whatever we're paying these people, it is not close to enough. But should there be, is the wider question we're trying to address here, Nabila, mechanisms for removing errant MPs other than elections? Surely it's up to the voters. They elected Nadine Dorries. In due course, they can decide to, well, they can't because she keeps saying she's going to leave office, but they don't have to vote for her successor?
I think there should be such mechanisms in place. She hasn't spoken in Parliament for over a year, and I think she should be sacked immediately. But as you quite rightly pointed out, at the moment, sadly, I'm not aware of any democracy in the world that has figured out how to deal with MPs like her. And I guess the principle is that if they have a democratic mandate, then they can do what they like until the next election, but that's not good enough.
They can actually be recalled in this country and in the US, but that does rely on enough of their voters being, how shall I put it, being asked, shall we say, to actually do something about it. So if they can't be bothered to do anything about it, then what does that say about the electorate that perhaps doesn't care about politicians?
There was some suggestion, indeed, that was why Boris Johnson resigned his seat, because he may have faced some sort of recall after being censured by or suspended from Parliament. But just finally on this, Simon, there's another issue that does occasionally get raised, especially when a particular politician has lucked into one of those basic job for life electorates where a loyal base will carry on returning whoever and indeed whatever happens to be campaigning under a particular party's banner. But it does have serious consequences. Senator Dianne Feinstein in the United States, she's 89 years old. She has been too ill to turn up for work, which has had significant actual knock-on effects. There are things that cannot get done if she is not there. Do we need to think, and the United States is about to pick a president out of an 80-something incumbent and very likely a nearly 80-something challenger, should there be an upper limit on age, as there is a lower limit on age in most places? Or again, do we have to think, well, if that's what the voters want, that's what the voters should have?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because if you look at our own House of Lords, which is not held in great esteem in this country, shall we say, there are members there, who are very elderly and still sharp as a tack, but have this incredible experience. So I suppose it slightly depends really what the position is. I think in a way, it would be a great get out, not just for the American electorate, but also for Joe Biden. If there had been an age limit, then he could at least say, well, I'm sorry, guys, I'd love to run again and be a wonderful president, but I've got to stand down because the law says I've got to do it. So I think perhaps with some elected positions, it would be a good idea. But I mean, you think of, Nancy Pelosi, again in her 80s, but knew when to bow out and say thank you very much, it's been great, I'll leave you to it, sort of thing. So it's a difficult one.
Having said that, I mean, Trump is the same age as Biden.
A couple of years younger, but there's not much in it.
And yet the difference in shape and health couldn't be greater.
So it does depend, doesn't it, on the physiology and the mentality of the politicians.
Well, we have entirely failed to sort that one out. But to Japan, and an effort to persuade visitors of the merits of sumo, the ancient national sport which sees two large and not overclothed chaps attempt to shove each other out of a circle. A troupe of retired sumo wrestlers are staging lunch events at which a feed is followed by the opportunity to climb into a sort of sumo onesie and try one's luck against one of the ex-professionals. Nabila, would you be enticed to a particular restaurant by the opportunity to dress up as a sumo wrestler and shove a Japanese bloke around a sand circle?
I can't think of anything more disturbing, quite honestly. I mean, I know those little sushi dishes get a lot of fresh airtime, and I'd hate to see those dishes getting close to big, sweaty sumo wrestlers. Frankly, they sweat like pigs, let's be honest, and you see it flying all around. So the thought of the sweat landing on my sushis is just...
Not even from a safe distance and behind a protective screen of some sort?
Not particularly, no. And also I think the mixture of elite sport or sport and eating is quite an uneasy one. For example, when I go to a football match, I'd like to get quality, to watch a quality game and focus on the game, and then go for a meal and, talk about the game and things like that. But I think you don't need to do both at the same time.
So wrestling first, food later, or possibly the other way around. Simon, would you fancy this? Would you fancy the opportunity to dress up as a sumo wrestler after dinner?
The idea that you can dress up rather than having to put on all that weight does appeal. I'd quite like it, I have to say, even though I do remember writing a story a few years ago about team bonding exercises in offices, and one organisation was offering you a chance to sumo wrestle your colleagues or whatever, which I have to say would be getting a little bit too close. Also, if it was your boss, would you really want to shove them out of the ring? But apparently some people suffered from heat exhaustion, so that's another thing you'd have to think about.
The team bonding exercise is one of those things, the occurrence, existence of which has always remained a total mystery to me, and maybe another subject. But we did want to talk about this one in a wider context, which is that Japan is apparently kind of interested in exporting sumo because they think that would give Japan greater brand recognition on the world stage and so on. And it is a distinctively Japanese thing. You often see it in films when they want to signify that this is happening in Japan. They will have in the background some sort of reference to sumo. But you then run up against the thing that the Japanese have run up against, which is that their national sport, sumo, is dominated by people who are not Japanese. I was looking this up earlier. In all of the 21st century, only 6 people have been elevated to the highest sumo rank, yokozuna. 5 of them have been Mongolians, and you add an American Samoan in 1999. So the question we wanted to ask, and Simon, I'll put it to you first, again, representing these islands. Is there something British which hasn't really caught on elsewhere, which you're kind of happy to see hasn't? Or are you still keen to export, British things, given that your people do have quite a record of exporting Britishness?
And then losing.
Yeah,
exactly. I thought that's what you were going to say.
Exactly.
This is the British tradition.
Teaching the world to play cricket at gunpoint.
And then losing.
And then losing ever after.
It's either generous or it's incompetent, a bit rubbish. I'm not sure.
Is there anything you would like to hang on to and just have it for yourself? Morris dancing, perhaps?
Morris, definitely. Or darts, I think, is a great British tradition that I can imagine a lot of other countries look at and think, what on earth would you want to sit in a sweaty room drinking pints of warm beer with guys whose beer guts are like the size of the hemisphere of the earth or whatever, throwing darts at a small board and risking losing an eye, sort of thing. So yeah, I think that's, I can't decide whether it is something we need to jealously guard in this country or whether we need to inflict it on other parts of the world.
See, for me as an Australian, Nabila, there is an obvious answer in that we have our own national sport, Australian rules football, which nobody else plays, and I suspect with very good reason. But because the Australian Football League is run by messianic lunatics, they do have this idea of trying to export it. And pre-pandemic, and I hope the pandemic, the one silver lining that it may have put an end to was once a year they'd got into the habit of sending two teams to play a match in Shanghai, like a proper game for actual premiership points. It would be played in front of a small crowd of bewildered Chinese people and Australian expats. The football was invariably absolutely dreadful, and the chances, I think, of the Chinese taking a serious interest in the game were virtually zero. But I always thought it would actually be worse if they did. I like the idea that we just have this one thing, no one else understands it, it's ours. Is there something like that? And you've got two countries to choose from, France or Algeria, that there's a thing where you're kind of happy that no one else really gets it.
I would say boule. It's quite
idea.
It's a nice, relaxing game. So I wouldn't mind seeing more of that being, played around in the rest of the world. Although I have to say, I do prefer croquet, interestingly enough, well, not least because I'm good at it, but I would vote for it to be exported, definitely. I think it's also, it's likely to be enjoyed even more with a nice traditional afternoon tea.
How civilised. I love that idea.
Well, on that happy thought, Simon Brooke and Nabila Ramdani, thank you both for joining us.